thanks everyone for joining. I'm Andrey Simonov. I'm here at the business school in the marketing division, and I'll be moderating the event. You might wonder, why a marketing professor moderates an event for state propaganda. Well, it turns out a lot of techniques that states and authoritarian governments use for persuasion and propaganda is something people in marketing studied a lot as well. We talked with Renee about this just before this. And so I study a lot of these issues in advertisement, but also from perspective of the news markets, how owners of news, how governments can persuade people and what are their strategies. And I'm also originally from Russia, so a lot of topics that Renee will talk about also is close to my heart because I saw it as growing. I was born and raised in Moscow, so I saw a lot of the things, how they work out. A lot of my work is inspired, and I work a lot also on the performance propaganda, from the more media market level, economics level perspective. So with this, I'm very excited about for Renee's talk. So Bruce already mentioned she's at Stanford Internet Observatory, which is a cross-disciplinary center at Stanford focusing on research, teaching, and policy work. She's been advising, I think, Congress, State Department, a lot of different organizations, kind of focusing on, again, research and policy. One thing that impressed me by Renee's work is breadth. It's kind of covered anything from COVID and misinformation to conspiracy theories to policy of AI implications for children content and state propaganda, both domestic and foreign. And so with this, particularly excited that she's with us, and she'll start with telling us about her recent work, and then we'll open the floor for questions. With this, Renee, floor is yours. Yeah.
Thank you for having me. I really feel like I should be doing spoken word or something. But instead I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, tell me if I'm whistly, I can't actually tell. Some of the work that we do at SIO, which is Stanford Internet Observatory. And Andrey and I had been talking a lot about ways to think about the internet as a complex system and ways in which new technological advances are picked up by state actors to use in a very, very long-standing and old propaganda toolkit. So I think a lot of people tend to think that state influence operations maybe started with, when they became aware of it, is the Russia 2016 kind of canonical example, right? The Internet Research Agency creating a bunch of troll accounts, creating a bunch of fake domains, fake pages, and working to influence American society, including American elections. But actually, you can think about that really as just the technological advance of a set of tactics and strategies that, that had actually begun years in advance, decades in advance. So when we think about state actor capacity, I want you to think about how many people know what a 2x2 is. I feel like this is a thing that everybody in business school does. There we go. So you have, envision a square, right? And you've got quadrants in the square. Normally there would be a slide showing this, but right now we're going to imagine it. You've got a broadcast media environment, and then you have a social media environment. And these are two different rows. And then you have overt capacity and covert capacity, right? So if you envision the combination there, that means you've got four types of capacity right now in a state actor propaganda toolkit. So you have overt social, covert social, overt broadcast, and covert broadcast. So when you think about it in those terms, social media is additive. It's something that they've added on as a strategic capacity, whereas previously they were using broadcast for propaganda. So you had your radio stations, you had your television channels, but to a large extent, your radio stations and your television channels were really limited in how much they would actually reach the audience you wanted to reach. A propaganda campaign is going to flop if you're not able to actually reach the people you care about. And so if you're broadcasting and nobody is seeing it, you're having no impact. But what social media does is all of a sudden it makes it possible to not only reach but target niches of people, very distinct groups of people, with propaganda that's very specifically targeted to them. You're pointing at me, am I okay? Oh, okay. All right. So what winds up happening is social media becomes additive. So if we think about Russia, for example, you have the Russian state media apparatus. And we're going to talk in this particular lecture, we're going to talk about outward-facing propaganda. So not the state trying to control the opinions of its own citizens, but the state trying to shape the opinions of outside populations for its ends. And so what winds up happening is you have state actors that realize that their broadcast apparatus is not sufficient for this, but all of a sudden the internet has given them the opportunity to make their broadcasters speakers on the internet. So you see RT begin to establish YouTube channels. And what RT realizes is that it can play the YouTube algorithm game, and that the algorithm is what is actually going to decide what people see. And so the very, very early content that Russian state media puts up on YouTube is not news content, it's actually tragedy videos. It's videos of things like the tsunami in Thailand, or amusement park rides collapsing very horrifically. And so it begins to realize that it can actually grow an audience using this kind of weird catastrophe porn. And you start to see other state actors begin to realize this as well. You start to see China realizing that it can do this novel thing where sometimes it's putting up fuzzy pictures of pandas, right? And everybody loves pandas. It's like the equivalent of kittens. And then also it's going to use the audience that it amasses with the sort of panda content. And then once you have that audience, you can reach them with the material that you want to reach them with. So what you start to see is social media becomes additive because they no longer have the broadcast is, people are getting their information more and more on the internet. They're not paying attention to broadcast media quite so much. And so they begin to develop this apparatus where you have overt social, overt broadcast, and then covert social and covert broadcast. So you start to see the creation of front media, so websites that look like they belong to a group of people that actually belong to a state actor. In 2016, you saw a lot of Black Lives Matter websites that were really controlled by the Russian state. And so that what they do, the reason for doing that is that they're able all of a sudden to present as if they're members of the community that they want to target. So this also has, as you see in marketing, much higher reach, much higher resonance, because all of a sudden you have speakers that are speaking to you as if they're members of your community, as opposed to as if they're newscasters or media. So that transition to a very kind of influencer-shaped model of engaging on the internet becomes something that state actors realize that they can use as well. And this is one of the links between kind of selling an idea and selling a product, right? That influencer-driven, very niche-ified media ecosystem actually becomes something that it emerges organically and for completely legitimate reasons, but the state actor realizes that it can incorporate it into the toolkit. And so the same way any new revolution in communication technology is put to use by state actors, so the internet also comes to be put to use by state actors. So this is the playing field that you find yourself in, right? So you have a very niche-ified media, you have a capacity for very, very small amounts of money to create personas that are highly plausible, that look like you're engaging with somebody who is just like you. There's a higher degree of trust. You don't feel like you're seeing a news broadcast. You feel like you're just hearing something from your friends. And that's the environment that we begin to engage in. Anytime you see a new emergent entrant into that system, you will see state actors go and begin to leverage it for their ends. So sometimes this takes the form of a new social platform. So in 2015, when Russia begins to do its work in the US, kind of dividing society, Truth Social and Parler and Gab are not so much a part of the ecosystem. But as those platforms emerge to serve specifically right-wing audiences in the US, turns out that the Russian trolls that also want to reach right-wing audiences in the US begin to establish a presence on those sites as well. So anytime you have a new entrant into the space, you will see state actors say, okay, we're going to expand this into our capacity as long as there isn't a large enough audience that they want to reach. And so the other thing that happens is when you have brand new technology as well. So generative AI begins to emerge. It's been around for a while, but it was largely gated. As new capacity begins to roll out, as access increases, what you start to see is the fake personas that used to use stolen stock photos or Instagram pictures or Pinterest pictures actually begin to use AI-generated faces. And there's a reason for this, which is as people become aware that there are trolls on the internet, they'll sometimes right-click and look to see if the person that they're engaging with is real. And then they'll say, hey, you're a stock photo. Why are you trying to manipulate me? When you start to do this with AI-generated faces, that kind of immediate detection of the tell is no longer there. So they've found a way kind of around, they've just incorporated a new thing into the technological toolkit. And so you start to see them using AI-generated faces for persona creation. And then what you start to see is as AI-generated content comes into the space, You've also created new opportunities to either generate images that serve your own aims, audio that sounds like you can pretend maybe it's a leaked leaked file that came from a politician that you don't like, or something that was secretly recorded. The same thing with video. Videos, we don't see it quite so often because there's a lot of different ways that you can tell that a video is fake. You have fewer tells in audio or images or text. But what you start to see again is as this technology becomes democratized, all of a sudden it becomes useful for state actors as well. And so a lot of the work that we've done recently is actually looking at ways in which new tactical capacity has yet again begun to shift the playing field. So one of the things that you used to see in propaganda campaigns, particularly in the broadcast media era, was that the intent was to persuade an audience, right? The intent was to make people believe that something was real, to change their opinion on something. As we moved into this very, very siloed niche collection of communities on the internet, where everybody kind of they're aligned around a particular identity, what we see now is much more propaganda that intends to entrench communities within their identities and then pit those identities against each other. So that is a particular shift, and that is kind of a function of the way that real people naturally engage on social media, the way that social media algorithms push people towards particular affinity groups, the way people go looking to find community. And so that kind of natural human interaction, that sort of natural tendency to find people who are like you or think like you, is something that strategy of entrenchment and division becomes much more useful than trying to persuade people, particularly as in the highly polarized societies like in the US, persuasion becomes more challenging, but entrenchment and pitting identities against each other becomes much easier. And then the other thing that becomes a lot easier is the propaganda of distraction. And that's where, when you no longer need to be writing a lot of content or having a lot of people sitting at computers typing, what you can start to do is flood the zone with content in ways where it becomes too difficult to know what's real. So let's say that you're looking for information, you see Uyghurs, the word Uyghur trending on Twitter, and then you want to go and you want to figure out what is happening, why is this word trending, what is the situation? Well, what you're going to see are the activists that are putting out content, people with one particular point of view, but what you'll also see is state actors with capacity and incentive. China really doesn't like when people are debating what is happening with the Uyghurs, come in and flood the zone with content that has that keyword in there so that it becomes very hard to figure out what's happening. And so you have some groups of people that are authentic activists, and then other groups that are automated or that are run by state trolls that will come in and they will fight in the same information space. And so you see this in areas where something has, there's a story that looks bad for a particular state actor. We see this in Russia in the case of when they accidentally shot down the Malaysian Airlines jet, MH17. You see them begin to flood the zone with 10 or 12 different explanations for what happened. When Jamal Khashoggi was murdered, the journalist who was murdered, and it was kind of connected to the Saudi government, again, you see 10 or 12 different explanations for what has just happened. China does this as well. And this is not to say the US government doesn't run influence operations, it does, and we've written about them. But for the sake of this kind of comprehensive, holistic propaganda, it really is very much Russia and China that have this extraordinary apparatus and are using it in an outward-facing way pretty consistently. What we see from the US is much more of a websites that are attributable, that are run through DoD, and then occasionally fake accounts that come and try to boost that content. So a little bit less sophisticated in this kind of holistic way, or we just haven't found it yet. So this is the way that things begin to emerge. And what is interesting about generative AI is it enables shifts both in the kind of covert broadcast space, where you used to be able to figure out that media was a front operation because the journalist wasn't real, or oftentimes because they plagiarized. So they would go and they would take content that real writers had created, and then it would actually be the editors of some of these websites. They would post it to their own blog. There was a blog called Inside Syria Media Center, and then Inside Syria Media Center's writers, who did not exist, would submit content that had appeared on Inside Syria Media Center and they would share it to ideologically aligned publications. There's a great case study written by the editors of an outlet called Counterpunch, where they talk about how this happened to them. But one of the ways that the Counterpunch editors figured out that this was happening was because this troll, this fake account, had plagiarized. And ironically, she had plagiarized from another troll. And so there was this sort of nesting doll situation that was happening with content that had been cribbed, but because you could search for particular sentences, they were able to uncover that this media outlet was not what it seemed. And then when they started to dig into the biography of the journalist, they found that there are no pictures of her anywhere. There is no indication that she exists. And so that's another red flag. But what starts to happen is if you don't have that plagiarization and you have this interesting component of the AI generated people, what you can do now is you can actually generate not only a profile picture, not only a face, but you can generate that face doing a whole lot of different things. So if I wanted to, I could make an account that would look like, here I am at my summer camp, here I am with my child, here I am with my husband. And so instead of it being one face that you can't find anywhere else on the internet, you create a much more robust character, and you have this content that is also wholly generated and untraceable. And so you create an environment where it becomes significantly harder to figure out that your people are fake and that your content is fake. And so the cost to create a very, very plausible operation really decreases. What we found with the Internet Research Agency and its operations in 2015 to 2018 through the Department of Justice indictments was that their budget was around $20 million for that operation. And a lot of it was because they were paying people, right? They were paying people to sit at keyboards. And when you're paying people to sit at keyboards, occasionally some of those people go and they become whistleblowers, where they go and they talk to news outlets. And so this is another way that information about how these propaganda operations are run begins to leak out. But what we're seeing now is a whole collection of organizations that are not directly tied to the government, but that do social media management. And the same way that you can use all of these tools for very good, normal content creation purposes, there is also this other side of it where it is becoming advantageous to sell the type of content, the type of fake personas and things like that. And so we're starting to see a rise in these mercenary organizations that actually serve global audiences. And so this is where that kind of, again, it's sort of a marketing context, you begin to see these sorts of things move into the kind of gun for hire space, the mercenary for hire space. So there's some interesting work being done right now. We put out a paper in January of this year that we co-authored with OpenAI, actually, where we started to ask the question of, okay, but what do you do about this, right? So we understand what is going to happen, what is the appropriate response? And there are some interesting challenges because with text in particular, it's very, very hard to detect. There's what we call the Red Queen problem, right? There's the adversaries are constantly adapting, the new generation of generators coming out, and then you have the defenders who are trying to figure out then how they can detect. But each time they identify something like, hey, the hands don't look like human hands, what you see is that in the next iteration, that problem has been solved, right? And so as soon as you identify a tell and you communicate to the public how to identify a tell, you're essentially ensuring that that tell is not going to be there anymore. And so the idea in Alice in Wonderland, the Red Queen says you run and run as fast as you can just to stay in the same place. And so the idea of the Red Queen problem is that you're constantly trying to chase this adversary that is advancing, and you have to get better and better and better faster, but ultimately you still wind up in a position where the adversary is ever so slightly advantaged. And so we've been trying to think through what are the ways in which you can detect this content, and so that's an entire section of computer science research right now. But one of the other things that we've seen that's actually perhaps more disturbing is that, for example, right now there's this conflict happening in Israel, right? And so you have a lot of images that are coming out, and most of the images are real, right? And they're very, very disturbing. And what happens is that if you want to discredit an adversary, you can say, oh, that's an AI generated image. And one of the things that we've seen recently is real images that are being fed into these new detector technologies like AIorNot.com is an example of one of them. And if some part of the image is blurred, particularly you can imagine for highly graphic content that happens, it will return that it is an AI generated image. And then you'll see this screen cap of the image of the real atrocity that happened alongside the screen cap of the AI generator saying that the image is not real. And then what goes viral is the story that, for example, the government of Israel or this Palestinian activist group has put out an AI-generated image, when in reality they have released real content. They're documenting something that actually happened, but because of the awareness of the technology and because of the deep distrust and the high polarization and the deep suspicion, you don't even have to actually generate the highly plausible AI-generated image. You can simply discredit the real content because the technology exists. And so we call that the liar's dividend. Danielle Citron from UVA and Bobby Chesney wrote a paper for Law Review that kind of details how this works. But that is kind of the state of the world as far as where we are with things now. So you see both state actors incorporating new and emergent technologies into the playing field that they've established over decades of operation. So everything that happens is a tactical or strategic shift, but it has to be viewed in the broader context of a full spectrum propaganda operation. And then at the same time, what seems to be actually far more effective is discrediting your adversary by insinuating that their real content is actually fake. And so that's the situation that we find ourselves in now. And I don't have a watch, so we can go to questions in a minute. But I guess I'll just close with the thought that social media was really interesting in that it took the cost of distribution down to zero, right? So all of a sudden, anybody could make images or content or whatever they wanted to write go viral. Anybody could become an influencer. Anybody could shape public opinion, could command a conversation, could amass a massive following. And so it really reshaped the media landscape, again, in that cost of distribution went to effectively zero. That was what disrupted the old mechanisms of delivery and broadcast media. And what we're seeing now is the cost of creation also going to zero. So while there's always been edited videos and edited audio and things that are not what they seem to be, we have just increased the scale and the capacity and the ability for anyone to do that, while at the same time reducing our ability to detect it. So what we're kind of moving into this age of unreality, and that's the, I'll leave you with that, I guess, bright thought.
Oh yeah, thank you, Renee. At this stage, we'll open up for questions. So please, if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll walk around and pass the mic. Since I have the mic already, I'll just kind of use the privilege of asking the first question. So you mentioned that there is this kind of AI development changed both production of propaganda and dissemination, but also our ability to detect propaganda. And in some ways, it's like a tech race, which happens sometimes it's easier to produce, sometimes detect. Where at the stage we're now, is this recent AI development makes it easier to disseminate and to produce, or it also helped us more to track it? So what do you think?
So right now, distribution is really the bottleneck. So you can create content, but as anybody, I don't know how many people here have tried to make something go viral or worked in an activist group and tried to get something out there. The distribution is actually still the limiting factor. You can create tons and tons and tons of video or content, but if nobody sees it, it doesn't have impact. This is the sort of point from the very, very beginning. And so once again, now as the cost of creation goes to zero, what you are seeing is like this flood of content. And so now the platforms, once again, find themselves in the role of being the arbiter of what's going to get through. And this is a really interesting position for them to be in, because they all have synthetic media policies, right? Every major tech platform has a synthetic media policy. You can go read them all. People don't always agree with them, but they exist. What you start to see is the platforms have to decide, is this generated media and is this account legitimate? And so the platforms find themselves in the role of deciding what is going to make it through. You've already seen, I think, the platforms trying to argue that watermarking technologies, right, where you have, when you generate an image, how many people have generated an image for something like DALL-E or Stable Diffusion or, okay, yeah, so half of you or so. So one of the arguments is that that should be watermarked and potentially cryptographically watermarked so that a machine can read that it is an AI-generated image, and so you've created an AI-generated image, but if you're an authentic person, that's fine. You're not out there to manipulate the public. You just want to share your cool artwork, right? And so when things are watermarked, the platforms will have to decide. Then the kind of second tier would be like, is this manipulative in some way? Does the account appear to be real? The problem is open source models and other things are not going to participate in watermarking. So you're going to have this interesting dynamic where the major companies, the major creators that most of us in this room would use, we're not necessarily going to like roll our own and run an open source model on a laptop. What you're going to start to see is the watermarking is actually just going to kind of signal that you're like a good actor content to have your image be identified, whereas what you're going to see is bad actors in turn nonetheless move to using their own systems, particularly a state actor, or using an open source model. And so again, the platforms are now struggling to figure out what image authentication and content integrity is going to look like. A lot of really interesting research in this space right now. But I think ultimately what winds up happening is it comes back very much to the behavior of the account. And this is one of the ways in a disinformation campaign, you'll look at the behavior of accounts and say, did this account come out of nowhere, claim to be in a conflict zone, and drop an image purporting to be exposing an atrocity? And then the platforms are going to have to decide, is this something that appears manipulative, or is this something that actually appears to be a brand new activist in a region documenting something? And they're going to have to decide how to curate that. So that's where I think a lot of the deep conflicts. There's many elections coming up in 2024 all around the world. And so the expectation is we're going to see this begin to happen, and we're going to have to confront this as a tool for political persuasion in the next few months.
Thank you so much. I'm curious, you talked about lower cost of entry, whether you've seen extremist organizations take advantage of this like changing informational ecosystem with little to no resources in order to scale their ability to create propaganda, and how those campaigns, if happening already, or if not happening yet and will happen, will differ from state campaigns using generative AI.
It's an interesting question. There are still, so ISIS is always kind of the canonical example that everyone points to. And ISIS has its own actually broadcast channels too, right? It really has that full 4x4 despite being a non-state actor. And so what you see is, I don't know that anybody has come out with a major terrorist group using AI-generated content at this point. I think that what people are looking for now is there an increase in volume and channels and a collection of new channels? And sometimes this is very hard to detect to what extent it's AI generated versus not. And one of the real lingering questions is, does it matter if it's AI generated, or should we just be reacting to it in the context of this is a terrorist organization and we have different policies in place for dealing with violent extremist content? I think for something like that, you'll see the violent extremist content policies will be applied. That's not necessarily a very thorny area. Neither is Russia, for that matter, honestly. The authenticity policies are one of the things that the platforms point to. There's, I don't know how deep in the weeds people are, but the platforms have dangerous organizations policies where no content produced by them, whether AI generated or not, is allowed to appear on the platform. And so that is kind of a cut and dry hardline moderation. People will fight about what organizations are added to that list, but that's where that policy is governed under. Then you have the inauthenticity policies, which is the problem with Russia pretending to be a Texas secessionist is not that Texas secessionist opinions are bad, it's that you can't pretend to be a Texas secessionist. And so the authenticity policies are what govern a lot of the state actor covert content. So it really is in much more the realm of like actually domestic activist organizations deciding to use it that you'll start to see the very, very thorny hardline stuff. And you already see political campaigns using it. And so there's a lot of questions right now around, in a political campaign, there are certain types of laws related to speech, right? There are certain types of laws related to paid speech or political advertisements. And so what you're starting to see is like, will that be the way that kind of content is handled? So it's actually kind of very distinct ways of treating it, and terrorists just easy line for that.
Hi Renee, thank you so much for your time. My name is Danielle. I'm a master's student at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. My question is for you is particularly relating to deepfake audio risks. And I wanted to know, coming towards the 2024 US presidential election, we've seen a rise in deepfake audio used by political action committees, specifically for Ron DeSantis' ads. And I wanted to ask you how you see that risk potentially legitimizing the spread of false information among the public and what you need to do.
I think this is the hardest line, right? Again, with the official campaigns, there are rules that are in place. It's actually much more the people who are aligned and decide that they're going to go do this to help their candidate along, right? So it becomes much more, that's where you're going to start to see it's political expression, right? It's free expression. Somebody's created content and they put it out there. And so one of the things, the president released an executive order on AI yesterday, right? And you can go through, it's 111 pages long, it's very, very long. I will say Tech Policy Press, we've kind of written a bunch of different articles unpacking various pieces of it. But with that, you're starting to see again, the regulatory space is only going to do so much. And a lot of it is going to be civil society and counter speech that is going to respond to the substance of the content. And also, I think what you'll start to see is norms beginning to emerge around, do people think that there should be hard lines? And I think that that's going to be very specific, like specifically within communities. And I think that 2024 is where we're going to start to see that first play out. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for that interesting talk. Actually, one observation and two questions. The first observation is underlying all of this is trust, and it seems like trust has really, diminished over time, and we know trust in institutions has gone down, and all kinds of trust has gone down. With the growth of AI and generative AI, I think trust in information has gone down once people become aware that this could be generated by AI. So, given that backdrop of loss of trust, what is it that can be done to regain healthy skepticism among people while at the same time increasing trust in legitimate institutions?
I mean, you're right. That's the problem. It's actually kind of nice to talk about state actors because, as I said, there's that hard line around authenticity. But the bigger problem is the problem of trust, and that's the issue with the Israel-Gaza example that I mentioned, right? It's that people who already don't want to believe something can very easily dismiss it, and that is what we're seeing happen. And so, in that regard, one of the things that's very challenging is that study after study shows that rebuilding trust and responding to this sort of unhealthy skepticism, this sort of nihilistic approach to, I can dismiss it because I didn't like it, is that people from within one's own community have to be the ones doing the pushback. And this is sometimes very hard to do because particularly in a highly factionalized internet, saying, no, I don't like this particular political point of view, but that image is real, right? Is I think a thing that is very uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable to do that. And so I think in that regard, the people who are doing work, this is not an internet problem. I like internet problems, right? This is the sort of, a lot of the work that we do, though, we say like, there are certain things that technology is going to fix, and then there are certain things where that is not the problem, right? The problem is trust. The problem is people feeling very unmoored, people feeling very, again, strongly tied into an identity and not wanting to do that pushback if it means alienating their peer group or alienating the community that they, kind of consider their online group. And so in that regard, I've been paying attention more often to the work of groups like, Braver Angels or some of these groups that work specifically on depolarization in the real world and communities where they bring people together who are of different identities or of different political alignments or whatever the dividing lines are. And one of the things that you see over and over again on the internet is that it's really the most extreme points of view that often get the most attention. It's the most morally strident points of view that go viral, right? It's people who are like, and the algorithms do it too. So you have influencers, algorithms, and crowds, right? And these three things function together as a system. And so the algorithm keys off the fact that some influencer puts out content that has like, a high moral valence to the language, right? It sounds very righteous, it sounds very indignant. And then the crowd comes in and they're like, yes, me too. And they amplify that and they boost that, and then the algorithm picks up the increased signal, and then the machine spins again, right? And so breaking that either requires an algorithmic shift that says we're not gonna boost that kind of language, we might actually boost a different kind of language, or giving users the power to adjust that slider and say, I'm tired of the conflict, I wanna see something else. Or this offline work that's happening where people are trying to say, you're seeing almost a caricature of your opponent in that most strident voice. Here is what most people in that community actually believe, right? And trying to diffuse that a little bit more in that regard. And then on the trust thing, I think the one final thing I would say, I actually found myself going to news sites like, NewYorkTimes.com, WallStreetJournal.com, and some of these others, because I felt like at least, somebody, I'm trying to remember, maybe in a conversation that came up today, said, if you want to find like the most accurate take, you should read the Associated Press coverage one day later, right? Because they've already edited it and all the new information has been digested. And so you go and you read it one day later. But we feel this, this kind of compulsion to be part of the story in the moment, even though this is the entire problem of like, online rumors go viral and the time it takes to figure out what has actually happened. In that offset, the world is going to change very significantly, and people are going to feel that they've been deceived. The hospital story in Israel is in Gaza is another example of this, where as new information comes out, the kind of the story changes significantly, and people have to decide what they want to believe, and they feel very deceived if a news article is updated. So.
Thank you. When I read rhetoric and messaging online about how we can protect ourselves from these state actors, a lot of the messaging, at least anecdotally, assumes that the reader has a pretty high-level understanding of the internet terminology, and how different social media systems function. But I feel like a lot of the people that are most victimized by bad actors are actually not very internet literate. How do we message to and protect the more vulnerable users of the internet from these bad actors?
It's a great question. I just finished this book project on influence, and I actually went back to in the 1930s, there was this thing called the Institute for Propaganda Analysis, and they literally made pamphlets, and they handed them out to junior high, starting junior high and high school, and then they gave them out to at the time, you would have in your community, your bridge group, your sewing circle, your bowling club, what have you. And so they actually produced what I really loved about the material, which actually was Columbia Teachers College was where a lot of them, Clive Miller was based. And the archives for all this stuff are in the New York Public Library. What they do that's so interesting is they don't bother to fact check it. They don't bother to try to correct this story or that speech or this thing. What they do instead is they explain rhetoric. It's basically just a rhetorical analysis. So there was this demagogue at the time named Father Coughlin, right? And at a time when the population of the US was about 120 million people, he had about 30 million listeners at his peak on the radio, right? And he was a fascist. So he goes through this kind of radicalization of going from being a Jesuit priest to beginning to say very sympathetic things about the Nazis to then Mussolini, and so he really has this progression. And what's interesting is they decide, okay, well, this is a problem. So you have the regulators trying to figure out what to do, the government actually trying not to do anything because he's very critical of the government and they don't want to boost him by being heavy-handed. And so this educator group comes in, and what they start to do is they begin to produce these pamphlets analyzing his speeches, not fact-checking them, just saying here's an example of the us versus them language. Here's here's an example of this. So it's actually very non-partisan, if you will, or bipartisan, however you want to say it, because what it's doing is not engaging with the substance of the argument. It's just engaging with the style and the stylistic approach. And if you've ever seen something go viral on the internet where every other word is they did this and they said that, and you're okay. It should be a screaming, who is they, right? It's a screaming red flag in that particular type of rhetoric. But it works every single time, And I'm where are the people making the pamphlets that explain this today? And they don't really seem to exist, actually. I think News Literacy Project does it, is like they're pretty good at it. But per your point, they're reaching middle and high school students, but there is this whole older generation that I think does not necessarily get that kind of content. I have little kids and they get this media literacy training actually in elementary school now. So for the younger generation, they're beginning to do it, but it still becomes a problem of how do you reach older people?
Let's do one more. And then...
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Connor. I'm going to be a student here. I completely agree with everything you said. Particularly with civil society in the 1930s, very robust, willing to create and release these pamphlets. Of course, the last 50, 60 years, there has been an immense decline in community activism. And where people identify themselves now, where it used to be in their Rotary Club and their bowling league, now it is the online communities that are being targeted, and uniquely, their hometown. And it strikes me that, the decline in civil society and the decline in attention in general makes it very difficult to organize on a local level and put in the effort to create exactly what you're describing. So my question is, what role and do you think the state has in revitalizing local analog community? And would that be effective in terms of changing norms to resolve some of these conflicts?
I think so. I mean, I really hope so. That's where I would like to see energy expended, even if just as an experiment in a few places, in part because I think, exactly as you note, people feel lonely, they feel disconnected from their real world communities. This is documented in 5,000 different ways. And so they turn to these communities online, which really fill that need. The actually decline in church attendance and commensurate rise in conspiracy theory communities is something that folks are studying now that I think is really interesting. There's a lot of, things like QAnon, right? These sort of more culty type groups have really deep religious undertones. There is an existential war. There's a war of good and evil. And you are a foot soldier fighting on the side of good by decoding these messages and sharing them with your friends, right? So you've just given somebody a mission and a sense of meaning, and they don't have that in their everyday life. And so this question of how do you restore that? I've worked on online activist efforts and you get really into it, right? I mean, it's fun and you want to win and there's a motivation and you have friends who are in it too. And I think that feeling is lacking for a lot of people in a lot of different ways. And so that question of how do you revitalize that or, kind of steer it in a more effective dimension. Right now, I think the absolute worst norms of the internet are coming offline. And you see that in ways that brigading and harassment and targeting of people that, targeting of main characters and whatnot that happens online. Now people think it's totally normal to show up to their school board or community board meeting and, scream obscenities and follow people to their cars and intimidate them out of conversations. That's that's the wrong direction, right? What you should want is the norm where even if we disagree very vociferously, I recognize that you're a person. That's the kind of thing that you want to see ported online instead of in the opposite direction. And so I think, as much funding goes to disinformation research and propaganda studies and things, I think actually in a lot of ways the more important places to invest is actually in that sort of community regrowth.
Renee, thanks a lot. Let me ask the last thing, follow up on this, but also try maybe to tie our discussion. So the topic of the hub is business AI democracy. And we talked a lot about how things can go wrong. So the question to you is how much we can rely on business to solve this problem of democracy with AI? And how incentives help business and platforms are aligned and not aligned? And is there hope that the market will self-regulate?
It's an interesting question. I think as I recall, I was looking at one of the Edelman Trust Barometers, and business is actually higher than government and media. I don't know if you've seen these studies recently. It's sort of a remarkable thing, given I was on Wall Street in 2008, and it just cratered, but here we are again. So it's, I think in that regard, that setting of norms, incentive structures for platforms in particular, I think are a little bit different, right? Ways in which the incentives of big tech really drive so much of what's happening here. So shifting that dynamic of engagement around what, right? The part of the conversation where we were talking about what should go viral and what should be boosted and what should be curated. That's an incentive question for tech platforms as they try to maximize time on site. As we're seeing, subscription models don't necessarily do what some tech executives hoped that they would do. So we're still stuck with ads. As far as other companies, I think what you'll start to see is most of them actually using generative AI internally, but having some kind of code of ethics around how they, what they put forth and what they disclose, I think is a positive place to start. I don't know if maybe that's naive, but yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for the help.